Hey everyone, Audrey here. Welcome back to another episode of Bite Size History. Today we're going to be discussing primary and secondary sources and who studies history. Let's get started. By the end of this video, you should be able to answer the following questions. Who studies history? What tools are used to study history? What is a primary source? What is a secondary source? And how to tell if a source is reliable. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at our learning goal, our benchmark, and our learning targets for today. Okay, going ahead, we're going to look at our benchmark, which is going to be the same. It's our standard one. Utilize historical thinking skills or historical inquiry skills and analytical processes. Then we're going to have two learning goals for this session. And the first one is interpreting primary and secondary sources. The second one is describing the methods of historical inquiry and how history relates to the other sciences. All right, so that leaves us with our learning targets, which include, by the end of this lesson, you will be able to apply source skills to documents and artifacts. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to corroborate or substantiate a claim to show similarities and differences between artifacts and documents. And our last learning target is that by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain who studies history and how we can learn about the past from artifacts. All right, like I said, we got a lot to go through, so we're going to go ahead and get into it. First up, we're going to go ahead and discuss who studies history and how history is studied. Now, when we are looking at history, historians are not the only ones that do the research. Research is done by archaeologists, paleontologists, anthropologists, just to name a few. They use science and other techniques to uncover and understand the past. Archaeology is the study of objects to learn about the past. And what these objects are artifacts, and they have been left behind by people. They can include tools, pottery, weapons, and even buildings such as the pyramids. Paleontology is the study of fossils. Now, that can include bones or it can include plant matter or imprints. And what I mean by this is sometimes pieces of leaves or different types of plants will actually get stuck between rocks and other types of debris, and it helps to preserve them so paleontologists can actually study what types of plants may have been living during whatever era they are looking at, Paleolithic or prehistoric times. And the reason for this is it's the time frame in which we don't have any written history. So the best way for us to understand what was going on during that time frame is through paleontology and the study of the bones that were left behind. Anthropology is the study of development of human culture. And this is something that is over time. Now, anthropologists will often work with archaeologists, historians, and paleontologists, depending on the era that they are studying. And they'll do that in order to gain insights into how people lived. Now, anthropologists can use fossils as well as artifacts that help them research different cultures. But one of the other ways that they do it is, say, if you are studying the Paleolithic era, one of the ways that anthropologists will try to understand how the hunter-gatherers lived is they study modern-day hunter-gatherer societies in order to gain an idea of how they exist. And then they will look at the artifacts as well as the human remains that are left behind from the Paleolithic or prehistoric era. Next up, we're going to talk about evidence. Now, just like in a criminal investigation, archaeologists, historians, anthropologists, and paleontologists all look for evidence in order to figure out or prove that their theory is true about an event, a civilization, or even an individual from history. evidence, by definition, is just something that is utilized to prove that your theory or thought process is true. Now, a piece of evidence could be as specific as a pottery shard from ancient Rome, or it could be something such as a sword left behind on a battlefield. So there are a lot of different aspects to what evidence looks like. And what we're going to do next is go into primary and secondary sources, because those are our two main types of evidence. Historians utilize documents or writings as evidence to help them better figure out what a civilization might have been like. And when they're doing this, they're looking for what daily lives were like for people, what they ate, what kind of laws they practiced, and also what kind of religions that they practiced. This type of evidence would most often be considered primary source evidence. And the reason for this is it's based off of the era that's being studied. Now, firsthand evidence is really when, say, a World War I pilot maybe writes a journal about his experiences while he's at war. Now, that journal is going to be considered a firsthand or primary source piece of evidence. Now, what you can do is turn that into a secondary source, and you're not actually changing the journal. Now, what you do in order to have a secondary source is take, say, 10 journals from 10 different pilots. These are all primary sources that you're going to use to write your research paper about what life was like during World War I for these pilots. And you can use all of their accounts and experiences and turn them into your own words. But you, in doing so, have created a secondary source based off of those writings. When looking at either primary or secondary sources, it's important to make sure that they are reliable. And that means double checking the authenticity of the sources. Especially for primary sources, what you're looking for is to make sure that if it's an archaeological find, that it's not something that's out of place that may have been just sort of dropped there or planted there in order to throw off someone doing research. Now, when it comes to historical documents, you're looking for evidence to make sure that it's not, say, a forgery or out of place for the overall opinions, which means like someone could forge a document that has completely different opinions of an era, and they may place it into a book or something along those lines in order to try and shift the views of how people might perceive what that era was like. Now, this doesn't help in the historical research process, and the reason for this is because it just sort of throws everything else off. Now, that being said, most of these, by the time you get to the research stage, have been weeded out because many scholars and other historians, people who really do firsthand checks into these types of documents when they are first discovered, are usually able to, through scientific processes, analyze the documents and state whether this is an authentic document or artifact, or if it has been faked and does not belong in a reputable collection. As far as secondary sources go, they need to be checked for personal bias, which we're going to go into in the next episode, and also to make sure that the research methods were correct. So real quick, we're just going to look at some trusted sources. So trusted secondary sources would include scholarly journals, magazines, books, as well as websites that end in .gov, .edu, and .org, as most of these are more likely to have factual-based evidence, and they're oftentimes more fact-checked for efficacy when publishing any materials. The sources for secondary sources that you want to be a little bit more wary of would be sources such as privately created web pages, because anyone can add anything to that if it's their web page. They could have completely fabricated, or they may just not have the information correct based on how they did their research. So that's one thing they have to make sure of. Another thing is to make sure that it isn't necessarily a self-published book, because sometimes what you need to do is go in and check their sources and really kind of fact check to make sure that the book was written in more of a scholastic or scholarly manner and not just based off of someone's opinion, because that can also throw off your research. And aside from that, secondary sources can be incredibly helpful because what they do is they give you a massive amount of information instead of you having to go out and look for all of the individual pieces of primary source evidence. Now, you can use certain websites to see what their resources page says, and you can look into their sources and use that for your research as well, because you can fact check and see as to whether these are reliable sources, and that can actually give you a boost for your resource or like contents for your paper. All right, everyone, that's it for this episode of Bite Size History. In our next episode, we're going to be discussing how historians and archaeologists use the 4 historical thinking skills to study history. What is bias, and how can personal opinions skew the validity or interpretation of a research paper? And how is history researched and recorded? Thank you all so much for coming. I look forward to sharing more history with you very soon and throughout this series. If you like this video, please make sure you go ahead and hit that like button and make sure to subscribe so that you can get notified every time I post a new episode. Thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful day.